Greetings and welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Igo, and I'm the Andrew Jackson Professor of American History here at Vanderbilt. And I'm here today with the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy. I want to welcome you to our program. Today, our topic is immigration and inclusion. Who decides who belongs in America? This is always a timely topic. It certainly is for me as an American historian, but it has been perhaps especially pressing in the last month as we've seen images of Afghan refugees and Haitian migrants at the Del Rio border. These images and headlines have thrown in really sharp relief the question of who is welcomed into and who is excluded from the American nation. This is part of a longer history of immigration and citizenship in the United States, which is a story of barriers and borders, of course, but also ongoing struggles to expand the notion of who belongs. Here we might think of the Naturalization Act of 1790, which provided way back then for the citizenship only of free white persons. Or we might think of the Dred Scott case that came before the Supreme Court just before the Civil War, and which declared that African Americans could not attain the status of citizens. Or the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that prohibited immigration from China and the immigration of Chinese laborers specifically. Or some decades later, the Immigration Act of 1924 that sought to preserve the quote unquote racial composition of America at the present time. That is to staunch the flow of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and to cut off all immigration from Asia. This was an act that would only be overturned in 1965. The question of who can legally enter the country is, on the one hand, a matter of political and administrative structures, both international and domestic. But on the other, it's a matter of culture, of race, of history, and perhaps morality as well. And so today, we are bringing together experts here at Vanderbilt in the law, in politics and policy, in anthropology and in history to better understand the treatment and fate of refugees seeking to become Americans. And also what this in the process reveals about the United States, which has often proudly proclaimed an identity as a nation of immigrants. So we have for you today really an embarrassment of riches in terms of expertise. And I want to thank each of our panelists for taking part today. I could say much, much more about the depth and breadth of their research in the areas we're going to discuss today. But because our main topic is so rich itself, I'm going to give just brief introductions here. First, we have from the law school, Karla McKanders, who's a clinical professor of law and the director of the Vanderbilt Immigration Practice Clinic, whose expertise is in immigration and race in American law. Also joining us today is Emily Henkin Ritter, who's an associate professor and director of graduate studies in political science. Her research focuses on the effect that legal institutions have on human rights internationally. Also joining us today is Jesus Ruiz, who's currently a National Academy of Sciences Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow in Caribbean history. And his research focuses on the histories of the Black Atlantic, on Afro-Latin America, and on colonial and early modern Haiti. Obviously very relevant to our discussion today. And he also has a background as a former asylum officer for refugees. And last but not least, Gabriel Torres-Colón is an assistant professor in the anthropology department and also associate director of American Studies. He's a cultural anthropologist with a focus on race, politics, sports, and intellectual history. So we wanted to start today with the big picture. Obviously, migration itself is nothing new. It's been part of human history for the last 300,000 years at least. And I thought I'd ask Gabby to just briefly sketch that larger context for us.
Sure, thank you, Sarah. So migration, immigration, emigration is part of human movement. And human movement from an anthropological, a deep anthropological evolutionary perspective is an adaptive strategy. It is a hallmark of our species, which can roughly be dated back 300,000 years. movement as an adaptive strategy has been foundational to our species in the sense that our sustainability practices, our interaction with our environment, and our ability to deal with conflict, environmental variables that are unexpected, as they always are, was fundamentally reliant on this strategy. So it's an evolutionary strategy, and if you look at other hominin type species, they're not able to do this as effectively as we have. So it is very important for our species, and so it is not moving and having restrictions on movement is something that emerged very recently. Depending on how we date it, we can estimate that out of those 300,000 years, it's only 6,000 to 10,000 years ago that we've had some form of serious restrictions of those movements, and much more recently, those restrictions have been imposed by the state.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Gabby. As you're pointing out, in some ways, this is a very old issue, and in some ways, a very modern political and geopolitical issue. I know in the United States, for example, there was actually very little effort to restrict immigration at the federal level before the Civil War, and nativist movements began to emerge in the late 19th century. Borders were relatively unregulated, and refugees as a kind of category don't really appear in the United States until the 20th century, largely as a cause of the aftermath of wars, World War I and World War II, both that displaced and made stateless large groups of people and created new kind of migrant flows. Humanitarian rhetoric would arrive at this time, also humanitarian organizations, but the treatment of refugees was always intertwined with older tensions around race and belonging. So let's turn to what governs the status of refugees today, and who gets to decide fundamental questions of who gains admission to the United States, and what the benefits, in fact, of citizenship and residence are. So how did this framework develop, and what kind of protections does it offer? Let's turn to Karla to sketch out the existing legal framework.
Thank you, Sarah. The framework that exists today to protect refugees comes from the United States ratifying the Refugee Convention in 1980. So what happened is the United States made the Refugee Convention part of the US law. And so there are two ways in which you can get refugee status in the United States. The first way is to be a resettled refugee. If someone is designated by the High Commissioner for UN, High Commissioner for Refugees, and they're staying in a refugee camp, they can be designated for resettlement into the United States. And they would go through security checks through the Department of State and Department of Homeland Security, and then they would be brought over to the United States. And those numbers are set with the president in consultation with Congress. The second way that you can come in as a refugee is to seek asylum at the border. If you're inside the United States or at the border of the United States and you have experienced past persecution, or you have a well-founded fear of future persecution because of your race, your nationality, your political opinion, or your social group, then you can ask the US government to grant you asylum. And once you get asylum, either in the immigration courts by an immigration judge, or affirmatively, if you are not in deportation proceedings, you can apply on your own and go through an interview with the Department of Homeland Security, asylum officers. And once the asylum officer or the immigration judge makes an adjudication, you then become a refugee. Once you're a refugee, after a year after, you will become a lawful permanent resident. And then within 5 years, you can apply for citizenship.
Thanks, Karla. Emily, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how this practice in the United States compares to other policies around the globe.
Sure. So as Gabriel noted, we have seen patterns of migration for thousands and thousands of years. But the idea of a refugee didn't come into being until the 1951 convention that Karla mentioned. So this is the Geneva Convention. It's a specific 1951 protocol on the status of refugees. And this is the first document, this first legal document that established what a refugee is and what are states' legal obligations when it comes to refugees. And the development of this document is in response to huge numbers of people fleeing targeted violence, like those fleeing from the Armenian genocide in 1917, fleeing the Russian Revolution, and then of course trying to flee Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And so the international community recognized that when there are wars and when states target their own people, there are repercussions to other states. They move across borders. And so we need to have international laws that help us understand how we're supposed to deal with these people. And so it established a refugee as a particular person that is a kind of person who is targeted for persecution within their state on the basis of their nationality, race, gender, religious, political beliefs, a whole variety of categories. And this has been expanded over time to include not just targeted persecution, but anyone who is in danger from extreme forms of violence in their society, right? Especially fleeing from war, civil war, external war, etc. So in 1951, states agreed that this is a legal category and established it in the convention. But of course, the United States didn't join this particular protocol until the 1980s, as Karla pointed out. Before that, other states had. So other states had agreed that refugees is a legitimate category. It means that that states cannot send them back to their home state. There's a definition of non-refoulement, right? So states are obligated not to return people to their states where they can be targeted. And some states were party to this treaty long before the United States. Most states are now part of this treaty, but not all. And it obligates anybody that comes to them and seeks asylum from this kind of persecution that they have the opportunity to apply and find a place of safety. That doesn't mean that there aren't other kinds of migrants that don't legally qualify as refugees, and they may be fleeing violence and they may be fleeing hardship in a lot of ways. And so this term of refugee is a very important one politically, but it's because of what it defines and what it obligates the state to do. But there are other moral obligations beyond that. And so some states are really generous with their policies, and other states are more restrictive. And part of that is often on the basis of race, which I know we're going to talk about. A lot of this is on the basis of the economy or the status, political things that are going on within that state, et cetera. So I could go on and on, but I think I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. I know Jesus has had encounters right on the front line in the asylum office in the United States. And I wonder if you can tell us how that has played out in your experience and what kind of results you saw from the asylum process in the United States.
Yeah, thank you all for having me here today and the Project on Unity and American Democracy for holding this conversation. I do just need to very briefly and very clearly state that because I'm a former asylum officer, I'm obligated to say today that I'm speaking as an expert historian of Haiti. So anything I do say today and discuss are my own informed personal opinions and evidence-based academic observations. So they don't reflect the views of anybody else. One of the things that I immediately saw working as an asylum officer was indeed that there were differential results. This was almost immediate. Immediately one of the first things that I noticed. There were cases, for instance, that were almost de facto framed in ways or in legal frameworks that seemed to be, at least in my view, as somebody who had no prior legal experience or experience as a civil servant, that seemed to be almost more legitimate than other cases in the ways that some officers sort of framed them legally. So I found that was often true with specific cases that I would then adjudicate. And in my view, again, as someone who didn't have the sort of legal training, just insofar as a sort of a career background, of course, we have a good amount of legal training as part of becoming an officer, but nothing like, going to law school or anything like that. But this is all to say that there were cases that, to me, as someone who had more of a socially humanistic training or perspective, that seemed to be quite legitimate. But then when I, went to present them, I found out, to my dismay, that they maybe weren't in the eyes of the government or in the eyes of our, particular adjudications officers there. So in the case of Haitians, for instance, and which was more close to home, so to speak, for me, it was clear to me that much of what Haitian migrants experienced, asylum seekers experienced in South America, especially, which is often the area that they were coming from, was rooted in a longer history of anti-Black discrimination that has, deep ties to the history of U.S. and Haitian relations. So yes, I was generally surprised by the ways in which Haitian cases, particularly political opinion claims, which were the majority of the cases that we saw, were not nearly as successful as perhaps other political opinion claims, say from countries like Venezuela. So that was, an immediate, shock to me.
Just to echo what Jesus said is that, in the immigration clinic, my students are litigating cases. And a lot of legal scholars, there's a study that came out probably about 10 years ago, and it was called Refugee Roulette. And it talks specifically about what Jesus is describing, like based upon the geography where you're located, the immigration judge's decisions vary widely. If I'm a Haitian national and I'm seeking asylum in Miami, I'm less likely to be granted asylum there. And if I have the same exact case and I'm in, Seattle, Washington, where there's a less of a population of Haitian nationals, I might be more likely to be granted. Also, the credibility standards that asylum officers and immigration judges have to apply. If you don't tell the truth about something that's not related to your asylum claim, that can still be a grounds to deny asylum. So it's extremely difficult when you're applying for asylum at the border or inside of the United States to establish that you individually have been persecuted or have a fear of persecution. And there are ways in which the law is applied so that certain country conditions are framed as political strife or civil strife. And in another country, a non-state actor will rise to the level of being a persecutor. And these differential standards, they impact greatly who has access to the asylum system.
Can we talk a little bit about the relationship really between the United States and refugees outside maybe of the legal framework, but the history of relationship that informs things like refugees showing up right on US borders? I think most Americans understand that one immediate cause for Afghan refugees appearing right now is the US military withdrawal from Afghanistan, but they may not understand quite as well the long history of relations between the US and Haiti that are driving immigration. I think here of the really resonant words of the journalist Jose Antonio Vargas, himself an undocumented immigrant, who said, "We," meaning undocumented immigrants, "are here because they, the United States, was there in other countries around the world, intervening in ways political and economic in the affairs of other countries." And I know all of you have views on this subject, so I'm happy to have anybody just jump in to tell us a little bit about why Haitian migration is on the front burner now. Yeah, Emily.
I don't want to speak to the Haitian case specifically, but I want to refer to the Afghan case really quickly, because I think that quote that they are here because we were there is a really important one. When it comes to where migrants tend to go, migrants and refugees alike, the vast majority of them will tend to go either where their family is or the nearest border. So they're generally looking at states right around them when they're looking for a place to go. So we tend not to receive a lot of Afghan refugees or migrants because they will tend to stay in the area, except that because the United States has been involved there, now there's this connection. Now are these specific connections with people who can get them visas and travel arrangements and things like that. And that's why they're coming to the United States, because of that specific connection.
Yeah, and if I can follow up on Emily's point there, I mean, as a historian, one of the things that, you know, I often talk about with some of my colleagues that are attorneys is that we explain to them how, histories of colonialism and particularly in Europe, right? But of course, in the case of the Americas as well. But in Europe, when we see West and Central African refugees go to places like France, because that is literally the language that they can speak, right? French, right? Coming from colonized societies, then that is sort of the natural place for them to go to. They're not going to, and that's just, my understanding from some of my friends on the ground there that are doing work with refugees. If I can, in the case of Haiti, this context is very long, and I'll make it brief, but the short of it is that Haiti in the 19th century is constitutionally, legally, a sanctuary for people that are born outside of Haitian soil. So Article 44 of the 1816 Constitution of Haiti literally states that anybody born outside of the Haitian soil, especially of African and indigenous descent, can come to Haiti and gain freedom and gain legal rights and citizenship. And so what we see in relation to the United States is that between the 1820s and the 1860s, Haiti becomes a legal sanctuary for African Americans from the United States, whether free or enslaved, if they can flee, particularly the U.S. South. And so what this does in terms of the diplomatic relationship with the United States is that the United States for a long time, from the moment that Haiti gains independence, diplomatically shuns Haiti. And it isn't until that 1860s moment with the Emancipation Proclamation that then US-based African Americans begin to sort of perhaps feel a sense of progress or Black progress in the United States. So Haiti's sort of role as a beacon of liberty becomes a little less salient, right? And so it is within that context that if we fast forward to that early 20th century, 1915 US occupation, right, coming off the heels of the rise of Jim Crow laws in the US South, what we see then is the United States seize on the opportunity of political instability in 1915 in Haiti. So they occupy the country, and that whole, the period of the 19-teens, the 1920s and 30s then marks, in my view, a major shift in the history of Haiti, from a country for over 100 years that was a legal sanctuary for people all throughout the Americas, now becomes a country of major Black exodus, right, elsewhere. In the Americas, particularly Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and other Caribbean nations. So to me, that sort of, that marks that point that then, if we go even further forward, the 1950s, we see the rise of the dictatorship of Francois Duvalier, again, largely due to the sort of the material conditions that the US occupation creates. And then later in the 70s, we see another major wave of Haitian migrants and refugees coming to the US.
I think it's also important to place Jesus's comments in contemporary context, because the migration, what we saw on the Del Rio border recently, is something that has been steadily increasing from 2010, when Haiti had, the first major earthquake. A lot of Haitians migrated to Chile and Argentina. Chile and Argentina did not have a visa requirement for Haitian nationals, and so they could migrate to Chile and Argentina very freely. With the start of the pandemic, we saw that Chile and Argentina were having a lot of issues. Haitians were alleging that they were subject to discrimination in Chile. And then you had them making the 3-month journey up to the southern border. And when they got to the southern border, you have what's called Title 42, which is a provision of the health code, which was placed in place by the previous administration, which said, shut down the southern border. No one could migrate or even seek asylum at the southern border. The Biden administration did not remove Title 42, which is a health code provision, and said that because of the pandemic, we're going to leave this in place, which prevented migration or Haitians seeking asylum. And recently, I guess it's been about 3 weeks ago, you had the Biden administration saying we weren't going to let anyone in because Title 42, sending Haitian nationals back to Haiti. And then at the end of the week, they let some Haitian nationals in to be placed in deportation proceedings and to seek asylum. Some Haitian nationals stayed in Mexico and some were placed on deportation flights. But when I took my students to the Tijuana border in 2019, one thing that was really surprising was the rise of course, the majority of people were from the Northern Triangle, Central America, but there was a significant population of migrants of African descent from Cameroon who also had that visa requirement to get to no visa requirement to get to South America, and individuals from Haiti who were at the border. And that was right before the migration protection protocols or the remain in Mexico policies went in place. So it's been a steady increase that culminated with what the incidents that happened at the Del Rio border.
I wonder, Gabby, I know you've worked in the area of borderlands and whether that concept helps us think about the relations between Haiti and the United States and the Caribbean more generally.
Sure. I mean, I think the concept of borderlands allows us to move beyond the notion of state-imposed borders, right? And so it's a recognition that society and culture moves across it in ways that are not inattentive or beyond the physical border, but they're not restricted by it. I think often when we think about borderlands, we're thinking about the cultural flow, the cultural factors, the cultural variables that are unmentioned when we think strictly through the lens of the state. And for example, the Cuban refugees after the revolution are often seen from the lens of the Cold War. It's not incorrect to do that. It's not off, it's not wrong, but it's also, if we think about it in terms of borderlands, it's also an acknowledgement of and a granting of asylum to white supremacists, right? You cannot ignore the fact that in Cuba, the regime and many of the first migrants, not the latter migrants, not the so-called Marielitos, but the early migrants were many of the folks who today continue to discriminate in Florida against Afro-Latinos and Latinos in general that are not white. This is something that we take as a separate issue nowadays, but it's not. That initial granting of asylum to Cuban refugees was a granting of white, an acknowledgement of white supremacy in a way that we don't tend to look at it that way, because the borderland would have us then examine the cultural flows and the role of the U.S. in sort of promoting and tipping of the hat to white supremacist projects in Cuba.
Well, I think this leads us into a topic that has been hovering, around the edges of the whole conversation, which is really what, beyond what's on paper, what is behind the differential treatment of groups seeking asylum or seeking refugee status in the United States, and what this has to do with national origin, with race, with religion in some cases. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that specifically.
Yeah, I can. One of the things that I think was implicit in my prior comments that I probably should have made more explicit is with regards to Haiti specifically and its history in the Americas. Haiti's emancipatory revolution is quite literally rooted in centering the Blackness as sort of at the root of their freedom, right? This is an anti-colonial revolution that essentially flips the entire Western world on its head. And so what we see is that if we look at it through the lens of sort of the entwined nature with US history, right, is what we begin to see is this diplomatic relationship, one in which Blackness is at the center of freedom for Haiti, but for the United States, anti-Blackness is sort of at the center of its long 19th century, if you will, political projects. And so for me, that is one of the things that I, again, echoing Gabriel's comments, is we're seeing it again. And we don't have to look at the images of the Haitian migrants out del Rio to understand that this has a long, not just a long history, but is that it's as a historian mentor of mine likes to say, that the past isn't even past, right? I mean, we're living it right now. And so that was a very common framework when I was working as an asylum officer that I saw was the ways in which political opinion claims, again, for Haitians, were not taken as seriously as, say, a political opinion case from a white Venezuelan, an upper class or even upper middle class white Venezuelan, right? So to me, the question became, what is the difference between a Black, poor Haitian who very convincingly has showed me that they are indeed involved in a political opposition movement, a grassroots movements from below, versus someone in Venezuela who also has very convincingly shown me that they also are involved in an opposition movement, right? To me, it seemed like we were looking at those two cases in ways in which almost seemed to suggest that the Haitian cases were devoid of sort of legitimate politics, right? And that was something that I better understood because of sort of my grounding in the history of.
Yeah.
I think there's an intimate connection between history and the laws, as you mentioned at the beginning, Sarah. Our first naturalization law was limited to free white men. You also have, when you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act cases, that the laws first, and then secondarily, the cases created this norm within Supreme Court jurisprudence where immigration laws become exempt or an exceptionalism to constitutional norms. And so we saw, in the Chinese Exclusion Act cases, a blatant discriminatory stance against Chinese nationals. Fast forward to Trump versus Hawaii, the same concept of immigration exceptionalism, constitutional exceptionalism, was applied to uphold the travel ban. And so when Jesus says, history is right now, I think we have not gone away from the racist foundations of our immigration laws and how they, the elimination of the quota system drastically changed the demographics of the United States. And one can argue that the pushback against immigration today is a result of removing those 1920 quotas and how we have, a majority of Latinx individuals in the United States because of that 1964 law that eliminated racial quotas. However, I think that our immigration laws are still being enforced and they still are connected to their foundations, which have very racist roots and are intimately tied to the racial project in America.
I think it's really important to point out that we've been talking a lot about laws and policies and government action and quotas and decisions by the government in a way that makes it seem like the state is the one that's making all of these decisions. And it's true that they're making the policies, but lawmakers everywhere respond to the people and organizations that have their ear. And so when we have racist policies in the United States, it's because there are people in the dominant caste who are pushing for those laws to be put into place, right? So it's when traditionally when in the United States, it's been when white men are threatened for their jobs, for when they're threatened for their social status, then they want to find ways to limit other people to being able to access the same things that they have, right? And so that takes the form of, in the 1700s, national political parties opposing German migration or Irish migration, or then eventually Chinese migration, Asian migration in general, right? So it has been consistently racist, but it's because of this, because there's a dominant class and a dominant caste that wants to protect its position in society, and then puts pressure on legal instruments and government instruments to put those laws into place. So it's a political outcome based on what people want. And so that continues today, as long as lawmakers don't push against that particular tendency of society.
This framework that we've been talking about here is, we've been talking about the US framework. And I think it would be interesting for our listeners, I know it would be for me, to hear about how conditions in the United States, or the debate around immigration and refugee admission, is similar or different to the way that conversation is going on around the world. And I know that's something, Emily, that you have worked on. And I also think I may have cut off Gabby there, who wanted to get in on this last question. So feel free to both jump in, one after the other.
Yeah, I mean, people are people everywhere, right? And so in similar ways, there have been changes in openness and closedness to migrations everywhere. And that's true whether they're refugees or they're migrants. That when economies tighten, states tend to tighten their borders, and that's true everywhere. And when economies loosen and there's more jobs available, there's more space for people, people feel very firm in their positions in social hierarchies, they're more likely to be willing to accept and encourage migrants and refugees into their borders. So especially Western Europe, those countries tend to be very similar to the United States in the way that their policies work and the way that they develop. Other states, there's not a firm, there's not a clear predictor, like democracies always do this and non-democracies always do that, because it's very dependent on economies, it's very dependent on space, it's very dependent on who's in charge. But it's always, Pakistan is very receptive of migrants and refugees, where, Great Britain closes its borders. And so there are lots of different variations that are particularly really interesting across different states when it comes to migration. But one of the biggest predictors are the strength of the local economy. And the more jobs there are available, the more open places will be. Almost as if it's a market where they're looking for labor. And that's true whether they're migrants or they're refugees.
Emily, those are excellent points. And I would add the sort of like cultural layering, thinking back to your points about the people who are supporting, who are electing, who are helping elect leaders, who are supporting dictators. Sometimes they're not, that's why it's not democratically done. And in the case of the Americas, it's interesting that a lot of the countries where we often associate as sending people to the United States also repeat these patterns. Often rooted in racial hierarchies, right? So we see this at the Mexican southern border with other Central American migrants. We see this in the Dominican Republic, a great sender of migrants to the United States recently, with Haitian migrants across that border. In my work in Puerto Rico with Afro-Puerto Ricans, one of the things that Afro-Puerto Ricans often complain about in their treatment as Black Puerto Ricans by other non-Black Puerto Ricans is that they are demeaned by being called Dominican. So there's within Puerto Rico, you have discriminations against Dominicans for being Black, and then you have discrimination against Afro-Puerto Ricans through the lens of anti-Dominican Blackness. The layers are there, and they reproduce again this racial hierarchy that essentially framed the Americas. It framed the formation of the Americas. And also I saw this in Spain in the Spanish-Moroccan border. Often people here debate the utility of migrants versus the cultural not wanting them here. But in that border, you can see electrodomestic goods be floated across the Spanish Moroccan border in Ceuta, where I lived for a year. And right the next day, you'll see that at night happening, and you'll see the police station, and you can see it just flowing. The flow of goods happens illegally because there's no customs border there. So that borderland still functions that way. And the next day you might have a wave of migrants trying to rush the fence, and it's violent and it's bloody, and it looks like a small act of war of the state trying to prevent sub-Saharan migrants, mostly at that time in the early 2000s, from rushing into Spanish territory so they can make an asylum claim.
We've been talking, I think, in really fascinating, troubling ways about the differential treatment of different groups seeking admission to now, not just the United States, but to states around the world. I wanted to hear you all think a little bit about the categories we use in US and international law, the distinction between a refugee and an immigrant or a migrant, an undocumented person. The law seems to treat these categories quite differently, with special humanitarian concerns attached to refugees. And I know there are other categories of migrants who come under humanitarian kinds of rationales. But can we talk a little bit about that? Who is given the status of refugee, and who the status of migrant or immigrant, or what we used to call an illegal immigrant, an undocumented immigrant. In the view of the federal government, who counts as a legitimate beneficiary of aid?
I think I can start out by framing this from a legal perspective. If you think about the buckets of immigration, the Immigration and Nationality Act is very complex, second in complexity to the tax code. But if you think about it, there are three main ways to immigrate to the United States. You can come through employment-based immigration, family-based immigration, and humanitarian-based immigration. And there are various categories, like you were mentioning, Sarah, under the humanitarian bucket. You can be an asylum seeker, you can be a refugee. What we saw with the Afghan immigrants were individuals were given by the executive branch a special immigrant visa. And special immigrant visas were given to individuals who helped the US military when they were in Afghanistan, and they applied for those visas, and they were able to come to the United States and immigrate here. Immigrate meaning stay here on a long-term or permanent basis. You also saw what's called temporary protected status being given to Haitian nationals. And so initially with the 2010 earthquake, the United States designated Haiti for a temporary protected status. It is not an immigration status, meaning that it only gives you temporary relief to remain in the United States. In August of this year, we had the executive branch redesignating Haiti for temporary protected status. Again, another humanitarian status, but it only applies to individuals who are in the United States at the time the designation was made. And so these are all of the different types of status that you can have under the law that are humanitarian in their nature, which is very different from when we talk about the moral categories and why individuals are designated in a specific way.
Can I add? So one of the things that that comes to mind in hearing Karla's comments and Sarah, your question is this question of to me, it seems like I can't separate the US's geopolitical stakes, particularly in that post 9/11 war on terror world. I fully agree with Emily's comments, right, that we cannot extricate or sort of separate these sort of broader geopolitics of the US kind of interventions all throughout the world with the sort of more kind of homegrown, right, generators of policies and politics. But to me, when I think about say, people fleeing terrorist organizations in the Middle East. What struck me when I was working as an asylum officer was that some of the patterns that I was seeing of violence, particularly from, let's just off the top of my head, groups like Al-Shabaab or something like that, weren't entirely different to the ways in which Central American gangs worked, right? And so one of the things that was often not really considered, right, in the case of Central American, particularly during the migrant caravans, was that that they weren't necessarily fleeing sort of this ideological anti-American terrorist organization, right? Perhaps they used terrorist tactics and violence or violent tactics, but to me that was something that really caught my attention, was that I didn't see that much of a difference, right? Apart from sort of the Down with America framework of some of these terrorist organizations in the Middle East, but in the ways that they kind of materially waged violence on Central American people, it seemed to me actually quite similar to the way. So that to me, the geopolitics of the U.S. also is something to kind of continue to keep in mind here.
One of the things that it's important to bear in mind is that whether you're a migrant or a refugee, there's some continuum that unites all people who want to move from one place to another, which is that they believe that their life would be better in another place than it is at home, right? And that is for a whole variety of reasons, whether they're threatened physically or they're threatened economically, or they got a degree and they know they can get paid more in another place, right? And so there are a whole variety of reasons, but they're all people who believe that the benefits of moving outweigh the costs of getting there, right? The other point that I want to make is that the idea of persecution that defines a refugee under international law is that the state is targeting somebody on the basis of a particular identity that they hold or a particular belief that they hold, or but that definition is quite narrow, and it has been changing over time. And in particular, our ideas of human rights and what human rights are is that the state is the one that violates rights. The state is responsible for protecting people and is the one that violates their rights. And in the case of a whole variety of migrant situations, it's not that the state is targeting people for violence, it's that they're not protecting them from it. So the cases that Jesus was talking about, especially in Central America, where people are not fleeing the state, they're fleeing gangs, criminal organizations. There are a lot of cases where people are trying to leave their country because they're the victims of domestic violence because they're women, or because they're trans, or because they're gay. And there are so many people who are leaving, not because the state will arrest them, but because the state is refusing to protect them or unable to protect them. But these categories don't neatly fall under international refugee law. They definitely don't neatly fall under US law as being deserving of protection, but they're not far off from these ideas of state persecution. And we need to think about what role the state has when it comes to protecting people from violence, no matter what the source of that violence is.
I wanted to add to Emily's comment that, you know, the US law does, while it recognizes the non-state actor, you still have the element of a non-state actor that the government is unwilling or unable to control in the law. And so, you know, when my students are litigating cases with, you know, a child who has been threatened by a Central American gang, and then on the other hand, we were litigating cases coming out of Syria, and you had both non-state actors behaving in the same way, we could put expert witness reports right next to each other, and the language would mirror the types of actions that both actors were taking, but there was differential outcomes for those two groups based upon American policies. And so this idea of unwillingness or an inability for a state to control an actor has been used in a way that furthers these racial hierarchies in the United States, and who ultimately gets to belong in the United States is determined in ways through our refugee system and our asylum laws.
I'm glad that we've made it to this point in the conversation and introduced concepts of gender and sexuality and other statuses that are shading and affecting immigration and refugee policies. I have a question really about whether you all think that recognition of those kinds of cases is pushing our policies in different directions, where if there is room to push them and revise them in those directions. And I also want to ask you about a relatively recent category that has come onto the horizon of climate refugee, obviously connected to environmental crisis. As Gabby told us to begin with, right, the history of humans is in a way the history of movement, and some of that is also now, of course, and always has been environmental. What do we think this is a category that our laws and policies and the UN framework is going to be able to address?
I'll start with a example that actually doesn't come from refugee covered by refugee law, because it comes from Puerto Rico, which is the U.S. territory. Say what we may say about Puerto Rico and its problematic relationship with the United States. When the hurricane hit in 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, we saw how the flexibility of movement was crucial for a lot of Puerto Ricans to be able to leave and come back in ways that were meaningful to them. Now, again, we can debate inequality in Puerto Rico relative to the U.S., but I think it's a good positive example, and we have good data of all kinds of interesting movement data from social media to the census surveys that show that flexibility, that there was a need to move given that the infrastructure was completely wiped out, and allowed for a lot of Puerto Ricans to come to the U.S., send money back, and keep the island afloat again, even though it's still pretty poor relative to any other U.S. state. And so I use this as a count. Again, it doesn't fall under the international law given the setup, but I think it's important to look at the ability of having a framework that works to alleviate movements of peoples as a solution to climate cost catastrophes.
I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to the question of what pressures or scholarship or activism is affecting the very shape of the frameworks we've been talking about. Frameworks that I think we've been also talking about as relatively static, right? There are all these people moving, but international law and US law are kind of these instruments that endure. Are there moves afoot, suggestions you all have from your own work about how US immigration policy, refugee policies could or should be reformed or rethought?
Can I just, sorry, Sarah, I just want to make a brief comment. I'm thinking here about the question of an environmental refugee, and I can't speak to sort of what direction, I don't want to speculate on what direction we may or may not be headed, but what I can say is again, echoing some of the broader points that we've been talking about, particularly what Emily was mentioning, I can't separate the environmental effects or catastrophes that we're seeing throughout the world with sort of some of the on the ground political movements that are happening. And so, at least in my experience, something that we began to see increasingly more was sort of water protectors, political activists that were very much rooted in movements, that were environmental movements. And so we began to see in places like Mexico, particularly in Central America, and and also South America, sort of refugees coming with political opinion claims, or what we call PSG claims, particular social group claims, that were intimately intertwined with sort of some of the environmental catastrophes that they were witnessing or experiencing in their country of origin. So that was one of the things that I think perhaps it would be worth thinking about kind of moving forward in terms of policy and the kind of broader implications.
Just to speak really briefly to your question about what our work suggests about the character of immigration policy in the United States. My work doesn't speak to things like quotas and who should and should not be let in. I mean, I have personal opinions and so forth, but I have done some work on the decision to leave, on why migrants decide that they're going to go and what kinds of barriers will prevent them from doing that when they want to. And one of the things that my co-authors and I have found is that whereas deterrent policies, things like threatening deportation, threatening incarceration, things like that, things that are intended to kind of deter people from coming in the first place, will only really deter people who are coming for economic reasons. And they don't really deter people who are fleeing violence. If you're fleeing for your very safety, being arrested or even being deported isn't going to be something that's going to keep you from trying to live. And so the more we ramp up our deterrent policies and try to make border walls and make really, these violent images of the way that Border Patrol treated the Haitians in Del Rio are all things that aren't going to stop people from coming, especially if they're trying to flee for safety. And so I think that a rethinking of what we want and what our goals are can inform policy, as long as it is taking into account why people want to go and the risks and benefits that they are trading off on individual decision-making elements.
Sarah, to address your question about what might we do and what our work suggests that we might do in regards to immigration policies, I would agree with Emily that we need to rethink the ways in which the system works and think about the normalcy in which racism pervades each and every part of the immigration system. And in thinking about how to root out racism, I always have conversations with my students about how can we reimagine or rebuild the system. I don't think it's too radical of an idea, because the Department of Homeland Security was just created in 2002. And it was a radical reorientation on the enforcement side. So I think we have the ability to recreate and reimagine our systems, but we have to decide to do so in a way that is cognizant of how racism has pervaded these institutions and cognizant of how constitutional norms have been exempted in their application to immigrant populations. Otherwise, we'll just continue to replicate the same systems over and over again.
I would add, to follow up on that, well, those of us who teach social theory, have to convince a lot of our students that the establishment of early social science in the 19th century depended on establishing that cultures were something that we could study, that society, right? The social fact, societies are something that we can study as an empirical reality, right? Something we can access empirically. Well, sometimes it's tough to get that across to students, but now I have a former Attorney General Jeff Sessions to thank for convincing students that the importance of defining a social group actually matters. This is something that we have to think about, and beyond that sort of historical theoretical lesson, I think we have to think beyond borders, beyond the particular issue, and ask ourselves, to what degree is the race problem in the U.S., to put it in Du Bois terms, to what degree is that similar to this issues of migration, right? Well, it turns out that thinking about social groups in a liberal democracy, it's not an easy thing, right? So we have inequity within our society, as we do, in ways that are clearly racialized. I mean, there's no denying that. The sociologist is clear on it. Part of the problem is politicizing and doing something, putting forth public policy to address those social groups and the disparity. And we shouldn't be surprised that Jeff Sessions went ahead and weighed in on what counts as a social group or not, right? And that even though I have no problem, and maybe it takes me 20 to 30 minutes to make a short argument about why women who are victims of domestic violence in Pick a Place are a social group. The fact is that it's different to just say it pedagogically, to say it scholarly, and then from saying it from a governmental standpoint, right? And so I think we have to find ways to take our lessons as social scientists, as historians, as legal scholars, and bridge what we sort of know from our lived experience in everyday lives and the humanity of human social groups, and how we think about it civically and think creatively to affect positive social change.
I was just going to say, I 100% agree with Gabriel. One of the things that really strikes me about Gabriel's comments is that when I was deciding to do this work as a civil servant, I thought about how for more than a decade, I had been essentially doing research, right? Like the social scientific research in archives in Europe, trying to figure out, ask new questions about, processes, historical processes. And so for me to have the opportunity to actually have somebody in front of me and ask them, what is your story? Tell me, right? That was something that I very much needed, I think, in many ways, but taught me a whole lot, right? And one of the main things that it taught me, and this, I think maybe this speaks to the question at hand, is that we have to have the imagination to listen, right? And so it is from those voices, whether they're economic migrants or asylum seekers or refugees, that if we listen to those voices, that we may perhaps better move forward and sort of policy making. So that's been for me the major thing that I've learned, and kind of, again, to Gabriel's point, in bridging the world of academia and civil service, right, is understanding those important voices. Yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on, the connection between scholarship and practice, scholarship and action, and also the reminder that our systems, our immigration regimes are, at base about the human lives, and the more that we can learn about the causes that are propelling people to move and to seek refuge, the better off we will be. I think the more we understand about the history and the culture of the way US frameworks have shaped up their implications for real life people, that this is the way that we will move our way toward a fairer and more humane immigration system in our country. I'm going to close by thanking very much our 4 panelists for their wide-ranging expertise, sharing it with us today. For all of you out there listening, I know that the Vanderbilt Unity Project website is going to be posting some resources available for those who are interested in learning more about how to help refugees and their advocates. And I'll just say once more, thank you again for an incredibly rich and interesting conversation, obviously an ongoing one, because it's an ongoing dilemma for us. And we'll close there. Thank you so much for attending.